Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm going to introduce you to a brand new series called Breaking the Fever. Lovingly curated by Jérôme Tagère of Preventable Surprises and Alison Taylor of Ethical Systems, Breaking the Fever explores what a post-coronavirus world might look like. Long-time listeners will recognise Alison's name. She was my guest in episode 25. In a weekly webinar, Jérôme and Alison invite expert guests to a lively series of discussions exploring the social, political, environmental, economic and governance consequences of the pandemic. Having joined a few of their sessions, I was so impressed by the quality of the guests and the discussion that I thought it deserved a wider audience. So I suggested that they also turn it into a podcast, which I'm delighted to say I've been able to help them launch. What you're about to hear is episode 10 of the series. I'll explain what it's about in a moment. Do stay tuned after the discussion, because I've also included a recording of the launch episode of Breaking the Fever, which was a brief interview I did with Jérôme and Alison that explains the genesis and aims of the series. You can find links to subscribe to the Breaking the Fever podcast in the show notes, and if you're interested in attending the live webinars, there's a link to the LinkedIn group where that's hosted there as well. Here then is episode 10 of Breaking the Fever, the podcast. It's on a topic that's both highly relevant to human risk, but also incredibly timely. J.S. Nelson is Associate Professor of Law at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. In this session, she talks about her work on surveillance, management culture, and compliance. The workplace has seen a striking acceleration of surveillance-led management over the past several years, and the coronavirus pandemic has given these efforts more momentum. Professor Nelson describes why surveillance can often be counterproductive, both to effective organisational culture and to human agency and human rights. She defends the imperative to resist unnecessary surveillance. Professor Nelson also provides some fascinating insights into the surprising origins of workplace surveillance, and concludes the session with her thoughts on state surveillance, with one eye on recent developments in the US. So please enjoy this sample episode of the Breaking the Fever podcast. If you like what you heard, do subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And now, on with the show.
Welcome, Alison. Welcome, Josephine.
Fantastic. I am super excited about this session. As Jerome mentioned, it turns out to be extremely timely. Josephine Nelson, who writes as J.S. Nelson, is a professor at both Villanova Law School and Management School. She is also an ethical systems collaborator. We haven't talked about this much on these calls, but Ethical Systems, the organization I run, is a collaboration of prominent professors who work on different dimensions of behavioral ethics. And Josephine Nelson works with us in a number of capacities, but not least on surveillance. I have spoken to her before, so I know how fascinating she is. I'm going to ask her, for everybody's benefit, to start with the basics. So Josephine, can you give us a kind of 1,000-foot view of the history of surveillance, its impact on culture, and then a couple of minutes on what is happening as a result of this pandemic, and then we will take it from there.
Wow, a couple of minutes, huh?
Yeah.
World history in a nutshell. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So I think let's take surveillance in a couple of different contexts. First, there's surveillance in the workplace, which is my particular specialty, but especially given what's going on right now in our cities, there's also surveillance by government over citizens. And I think we need to talk about that. And they have similar histories that are intertwined. The techniques seem to be similar in many ways, but the the expressions of them and certainly the law governing them are very different. So we can talk about that. If we're going to talk about specifically the surveillance of our populations by governments, that's got a history since time immemorial, where rulers of tribes have set up networks of people to talk to them and observed behavior and thought about this, and this has gotten more and more technologically sophisticated. We can talk specifically about what's happening on the streets of our cities, and there's a lot to talk about in terms of what protesters might think about to protect themselves from surveillance that feels intrusive, and or think about ways in which they can protest and keep their what we would think of as privacy at the same time from police surveillance and from government surveillance. In terms of the workplace, I think that also has a tremendously long history, and as long as people have delegated tasks to others to do, there's been a need to make sure that those tasks are done in a way that you would like them to be done. But that has changed significantly over time. And if you go back, let's just take from the time of the medieval guilds, when workers in the guilds would work, they would have freedom to pause during a job, to do the job in the way that they saw fit. The guilds were fairly autonomous. The place of craftspeople in particular was had fairly high status, especially in a society in which not a lot of people had freedom from agricultural work. And so that was kind of our history of how people worked independently. Over time, as we have developed ideas of so I'm going to be very careful here. I'm not going to use the words employer and employee to describe relationships, because in employment law that gets very complicated. You have independent contractors, the gig economy, and other people. But if we're talking about the dynamics, we can talk about the worker-manager relationship. And so between the worker and the manager, there has been an evolution in how we've thought about managing people. And it has gone through some interesting technological changes, but also some dark cultural changes that we need to talk about. So one of the things that was really a change for the guild system of working was the stopwatch and the idea of time, and someone would own your time versus own your product and commission you to do a project. So with the stopwatch, there came this idea that you would clock in and clock out, and you would have more routine breaks, and suddenly your life became far more regimented, and it wasn't necessarily tied to the sun or the nap in the middle of the day or whatever it is that you needed to do to regulate your own production. The person who was commissioning this wanted to regulate all parts of your workplace, increasingly through the Industrial Revolution. What really was a particularly striking change in how management has surveilled and monitored workers is the evolution of what we think of now as modern management techniques. And those are rooted in, and there's no other way to say this except just flat out talk about the new work that's coming out of management studies history and the marvelous material that's available now. The roots of modern management are in the slave plantations of the U.S. South and the West Indies. So what was happening in the U.S. South and the West Indies on those slave plantations? For the first time, they went from a gang system of supervision. So think of a prison gang on the side of a road working under supervised conditions for a certain period of time to do something like pick up trash or whatever it is. And they worked for an hour at that or whatever it was. That's how enslaved people were supervised before. The revolution that happened in the U.S. South and the West Indies, and I build on the scholarship of many people here, Caitlin Rosenthal, Matthew Desmond, many people have done amazing work in this, and I'm just relating what the work is. They have seen that it was on those plantations that for the first time we really thought about people as units, as cattle, as something that you would own and control and manage in a very finite way. For the first time, we get the task system out of the plantations. So instead of being, an enslaved person being supervised for a certain period of time, and that was their work, all of a sudden they might, and I'm giving this as a hypothetical, be in the blacksmith shop and be tasked with producing a certain number of horseshoes a day. And that was their task for the day. By the way, supervised by a taskmaster. Literally, the words from slavery, task is a word from slavery, taskmaster is a word from slavery. And they would be paid monetary bonuses if they exceeded the task. So slaves, this is all part of the new research coming out. Yes, slaves were paid money. They used money. Money was used as an incentive to get enslaved people to do things. There was tremendous physical brutality on plantations, but what's really interesting about the new research coming out is how very specifically married that physical brutality was to economic incentives. And often overseers were not allowed to physically discipline enslaved people. They were, the primary focus of this was to get them to produce a certain amount of work in a certain way. So that is all really important and really interesting, because what happens is after the Civil War, there is an engineer named Frederick Winslow Taylor who resuscitates the task work and the other changes in management supervision after the Civil War, literally whitewashes them and declares that they are the principles of scientific management and that all of this is scientific. How does he know what a person can do in a day? Well, the old way to do it was that you were measured as what if a good field hand was worth a certain amount of production, then people were considered half a hand, quarter of a field hand, whatever it was, right? That was the measure. Well, Frederick Winslow Taylor and Taylorism just says, oh, well, that's the human being is a machine. It just uses the language of progress and science and mechanics to say the human machine can run at this level of efficiency and you need to push them to this level of efficiency this way. What was that? That was a good field hand who would work at this level, and everybody would be pushed to the level of the field hand. Or whatever job it was. That was what was pre-existing on the plantations before. And it just gets translated into this language of scientific management and blows up after the First World War, during the First World War, as these methods are put into production. Congress, by the way, at the time knew exactly what Taylor was doing and called him out on it and concluded that these management techniques worked exactly the way as, and I'm quoting the language, and I'm cleaning it up a little bit to say exactly the way that it worked on the slave plantations with enslaved people to drive them. So that was their Congress's conclusion after looking at Taylorism and those methods. But we've lost that whole history, and now we've found more and more technologically sophisticated ways to essentially manage through those same techniques. And so it should be a particular concern to us, given that dark history and dark path and those dark origins of modern management techniques, that there is a huge play in the gig economy called literally TaskRabbit, right? Task from slavery. And we have all these other pieces that we're using. And we can talk about how surveillance and the technology of surveillance has dramatically changed, but the methods underlying them in modern management are very much those same methods from the plantations and do have this very dark history that needs to be talked about.
So that's, I think, probably news to a lot of people. It was to me, and then I started reading around about this topic, and it certainly explains a lot. So where would you say, and there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about surveillance capitalism, and obviously this very well-known and widely discussed book, which has gone some way to raise awareness of these kind of issues. But can you walk us through where you think we were in December 19, and then where you think we are on June 2nd, 2020, in terms of how management is thinking about surveillance tools and the awareness and agency of workers to respond right now.
Wow, we've had some big changes with COVID-19 and the lockdowns. So this is a huge issue, and I'll take it apart just a little bit and we can continue the conversation. But when people who could work from home were forced to work from home, we know that the sales of worker surveillance software more than tripled. So, and we know that there was an initial management response, which was to feel out of control of this situation. And out of control for all kinds of reasons, economic reasons that had to do with whether their businesses would survive, with their customers survive. So there were all kinds of things going on. But part of that feeling of out of control was also not seeing their workers actually report to a physical office and be able to surveil them the way that they had with the other methods in the past. So what we saw was this massive growth of online surveillance. And let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. And we also need to talk about the fact that surveillance looks very different depending on what kind of job you do. So if you are, it's only a majority of the top quartile of people's incomes, people with the highest incomes, that can actually even do their jobs remotely. So when you're talking about surveillance for an essential worker who's going to work in a hospital, work in a warehouse, do something else that is physical, that surveillance looks very different. We could talk about what that surveillance looks like. But in terms of people working online, which tends to be frankly, the most privileged workers who can work online, even that has changed dramatically since the COVID-19 lockdown. So we've seen, as we mentioned, a growth in the use of surveillance products. What does that look like for that top quartile? Taking your photo every 5 to 10 minutes through your screen. Now, when you are in your bedroom, that photo could take a picture of your bedroom, your spouse, your children, whatever's going on in your life, because that is automatically taking its photos every 5 to 10 minutes, regardless of where you're physically working. And when home becomes where you're physically working, it's taking the photos of you at home. It's monitoring your keystrokes. They can listen to your microphone recordings. Often taking a look, there's depending on how the software is set up, the software can be set up to flag certain patterns that an employee might have. So for example, if someone, opens their resume and then takes a look at their contact book, all of a sudden a red flag can go up for the employer. This person might be thinking about leaving, right? So you can set up pattern recognition for what someone's doing on their laptop. You're also setting up, often in the surveillance software, how much someone is in any given program. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, whatever it is that's used where that person is, how much they're in that given program, how often their keystrokes are being entered, the patterns of their keystrokes. You can look for certain words, certain things. The fascinating thing is, and this is a larger discussion, that we really have been transformed. Before this happened back in December, we were actually an economy largely based on fear when you think about how little protection many workers have from managers and what was happening in the economy generally. But since the lockdowns and since the fact that over 40 million Americans have lost their jobs just in the last 7-8 weeks, we are really very much in an economy driven by fear. And so what you're seeing as the response to that is that the average work day for someone who can work remotely is expanding by about 3 hours. That's not happening in other countries in the same way, not countries that have protection of workers in different ways. That speaks to fear. It also speaks to, there are many other indications that people are incredibly fearful. there are issues of, you can see that people are starting to hoard goods. Consumer confidence is down dramatically. The economy is terrible. That economic statistic tells you that about 1 in 4 American workers no longer has a job, and so workers are thinking, even at that top level of income where you can work from home, they're thinking about the fact that they could be laid off, that their employer could be looking for, that the manager could be looking for ways to cut them. And I've heard from people again and again that they can't display weakness. But this is at the same time as schools are closed, people are caring for sick relatives, they may be sick themselves. The average working woman in America is now working 65 hours a week outside her job in unpaid labor. So the pressures on people are just tremendous, and they are terrified about losing their jobs at the same time.
So that's bad enough for the privileged among us. Can you talk a little bit about the blue collar sector, the people in warehouses, the Uber drivers, the people delivering our takeouts? What's happening there? And then let's talk about the management perspective, but let's go one step at a time.
Sure, just in terms of physical surveillance. So what we're seeing is an elevation of physical surveillance there, and we're also seeing a repression of speech at the level of people who are essential workers. We're seeing that at other levels as well. We saw that with hospital employees who are speaking out about the lack of personal protective equipment, PPE, and we saw hospitals fire people for posting on their personal Facebook or other accounts about what their personal experience was with this. We know that nurses have been fired for this. We know that there's been an outcry at Amazon in warehouses about the lack of personal protective equipment, lack of safety protocols. There have been, Amazon at first was telling us how many numbers of people in their warehouses came down with COVID-19, but we lost track in the hundreds. And how fast they were spreading. People were not getting breaks that they needed. They weren't getting hand sanitizer. They weren't getting the social distancing that they needed at work to do their job properly. And there was a common concern that large employers like Amazon, a lot of this has been written about Amazon, so I can talk about that, but this is many employers in many places, many large businesses, many places, have been pushing essential workers to work under conditions that are, that these workers are not convinced are protecting their physical safety. And a lot of them did not sign up to, if they felt that they were going to be a cashier in a grocery store, they didn't sign up to die, in the process of taking your money. Or if they're delivering you food, for maybe a $5 tip, they didn't sign up to take COVID-19 home and kill their grandparents who they may live with. I mean, this is asking tremendous things of people in a situation in which they didn't sign up for this, and they don't feel appreciated, and they don't have any protections. So if they quit, they're often not allowed to file for unemployment insurance. Now, if they are actually taking care of, I want to make this point about the law, in many places, if they are taking care of a minor or some other person who is dependent on them and needs them, they may still qualify for unemployment insurance. But if it's just an issue of, I didn't sign up for this and I don't want this, and these are not the terms and conditions that I am willing to do, they can't even get unemployment insurance. And the economy is so bad you can't get another job. So people are desperate, they're scared, they're worried. I think another part of this is the racial element of it. And the gender element. Let's talk about that. Over 75% of healthcare healthcare workers in our large cities are women. And they had been on the front lines of caring for people during COVID-19 under horrendous conditions where they often didn't have personal protective equipment. They got sick in enormous numbers. They died for this. And now, as you know, the hospitals are facing a financial crisis and they're being laid off in record numbers. workers. Women are the brunt of the service industry, and they are taking the brunt of the layoffs during this recession, which is actually, frankly, of depression at this point. Probably the largest downturn we've had in the economy since the Great Depression. I think that's uncontroversial to say from the numbers. In our warehouses, a majority of the warehouse workers are minorities. In some urban centers, for example, Newark, New Jersey, it's 95%. And minorities, immigrants, people without a whole lot of power, to protest in the system, to renegotiate these issues. And they may have had hazard pay initially that kept them going, but they didn't have a lot of ability to negotiate the hazard pay, and now that's being pulled back. So there is an issue of feeling exploited. The African American community, for example, has been disproportionately part of our essential worker service. In fact, if you think about who the prototypical essential worker is right now, that person is an African American woman, right? Leaving her home, leaving her children, leaving parents at home to go do a job that we've declared to be essential, but that will put her health potentially and the health of her family, her immediate family, on the line. And that's who this economy has put the brunt of our activity since the beginning of COVID-19 on those shoulders, on their backs. And so they're catching COVID-19 at numbers far higher than other ethnic groups. I talk about African Americans and Latinos here. There's two groups that are catching COVID-19 at far higher numbers because they tend to have these essential jobs, and they're dying at far, far higher rates than other populations are. So it is really a privilege not to have to leave your house, not to have to communicate with the public directly, not to have to be where someone might sneeze or cough on you in a meat packing plant, in a warehouse. It's something else. So in terms of surveillance, you asked specifically about that. This is a population that has been upset with the companies that they work with for a while. Part of that is the constant scheduling changes that you see, for example, at Walmart, where you don't necessarily know what your schedule is going to be from week to week, which is very difficult to have to schedule childcare, to pick up an elderly relative, to do anything else. So it feels very invasive and controlling of your whole life. In addition to that, there's been a breakdown of trust, essentially between many groups of workers and their employers. So when we saw recently that Amazon was creating heat maps of its 520 odd Whole Food stores, people initially thought, oh, is that to find out whether people had customers or workers had fever? No, it wasn't. It was to prevent unionization. It was to watch who different workers talk to, how they track across the floor, who their social groups are going to be. And it was being cross-referenced with a ton of other data, essentially to cut off the ability of workers to organize and to talk about better working conditions. We're also seeing that alleged violations of COVID-19 quarantines and other things are being used to drum out workers. So Amazon got in trouble for, it was a very public issue when they fired a worker who was protesting the lack of personal protective equipment and conditions inside the warehouse, related also to just how Amazon's been treating its workers. And they fired him, and allegedly they fired him for coming back when he should be under quarantine for COVID-19. And it came out in meetings with executives that they were trying to personally smear him because they didn't want him to be able to represent and speak about worker protection. And then they fired several white-collar workers in Amazon tech services who had tried to bring attention to conditions in the warehouse. Other methods of surveillance, definitely clocking in, clocking out, the facial recognition. So there's all this technology coming that was originally developed in China and for the Chinese surveillance state. So kind of crossing between our two themes of surveillance by a government of a population and surveillance by by a company of its workforce. By the way, I am not the first person to make that analogy to talk about this. Elizabeth Anderson has talked extensively about companies now becoming private governments that you have to live under and that control your every action. We can talk about more on that. But in terms of these surveillance tools literally coming out of China and the Chinese state and then being sold both to governments but also on the private market by companies that either were US based and developed them for China or Chinese based and tried to find markets for this surveillance software elsewhere, you can track someone through a crowd. So you can do a heat map of a crowd, you can do the facial recognition of the person and watch them move through the crowd. You can see who they talk to, what they are saying. By the way, the facial recognition at this point is so good that you can read emotions, you can read sexuality, you can, it's extraordinary what facial recognition software is doing. And we know that it's being used routinely in US airports and in other places. I can talk about the cell phone beacon technology so that we can literally ping your cell phone from place to place. So one of the things that intertwines concerns about tracking people, contact tracing during a pandemic, and essential data privacy and or worker surveillance concerns are some of these new services that are being offered. So PwC has been talking about offering a new service that would essentially be a private employer's version of the service that the administration wanted Google and Apple to roll out, where your cell phone through Bluetooth technology would ping off of other beacons or otherwise leave a trace of where you had been during any given period of time. The theory being that if you tested positive for COVID-19, there could be a tracing of your cell phone's contacts through the day or whatever period of time that they wanted to keep before you contacted the virus, and they could give a warning to those other people. Well, 3 out of 5 Americans say that they're either not comfortable with that or couldn't adopt it, that it's just creepy, that they don't want Google and Apple knowing exactly where they've been, and they don't want their cell phone broadcasting at all times who they've been in contact, who they've been standing near. That is essentially just putting a GPS tracker on someone full time. And a lot of, and there is a point about false positives too. This technology works through walls. So if you were standing on one side of an office, another person was standing on their side of, close to the part of the office that you were standing on, but there was a wall between you, the beacon could think that you guys have been in contact. This is a huge problem with the Chinese surveillance state because you can get a lot of false positives and there's no route of appeal. To say, no, I didn't talk to that person. I didn't do something that you're accusing me of. Well, if 3 out of 5 people are either uncomfortable or unable to adopt this technology in the general public, imagine what it would feel like if your employer essentially said, we have the same system rolling out in the office space. And we are now, as PwC is talking about selling this technology that will allow your employer to watch at all times as you come into the building. You ping off of things, who you might be around, you ping off of that, their phones, the different beacons embedded in different parts of the office. They could see exactly who you're talking to, where you're moving through the office at all times. And if we know that people are already uncomfortable with that, then, yes, the argument might be, well, we can see whether you're properly socially distancing. But the argument could also be, why do you need to do it that way? Why don't you just talk to us about socially distancing when we come into the office and set up the office appropriately? Why do you need to know that I've, gone over to Mary's desk 3 times or Joe's desk or whatever it is? And now you have my network of who I talk to in the office, who I'm friends with, who I might be organizing with, right? Specifically the Amazon situation. Similarly, there's been a conversion of security cameras to be able to do body counts inside office buildings. Theoretically, again, for COVID-19 purposes, to make sure that, people are socially distancing. But once you've done that conversion, why don't you just put the facial recognition software in there. And then you can watch the crowd when the boss makes an announcement and the person who looks less than thrilled gets fired the next day. There's so much going on here about the level of surveillance and the level of that's layered over an issue of coercion, fear, discomfort, inability to protest, inability to negotiate really as equal parties in any meaningful way that we really need to talk about.
I have a lot of questions. I want to come back to this state surveillance and the relationship between state and private, and also to what's been going on in the US over the weekend. But before we go there, I mean, I think I can gather from a lot of what you said what the management logic is of why to do this. And it's probably not that. I mean, it's probably pretty obvious.
Not necessarily. I think there are a lot of really good people caught up in this. Especially if you talk about compliance officers. I think that that's really important. I think compliance officers know, for example, that they can turn on your camera remotely and your mic and your microphone remotely, and they have under certain circumstances. But they know that that's creepy. That when you turn in your personal device to the company and they put all this tracking software on it so they can watch your social media content and they can watch your texts and your emails and put a GPS tracker on it so they know exactly where you are at all times. By the way, it doesn't turn off. So part of what we're talking about is a blurring of boundaries in different ways, boundaries of time. So all of a sudden we're working 24/7. We don't punch in, we don't punch out. There was a great case from California where they actually had software that they had put on an employee's phone, a worker's phone. I'll try to be careful about my language here. A worker's phone. And she was supposed to clock in and clock out, and it would show her GPS coordinates of where she was going because she was supposedly doing deliveries for the company or something like that. Well, it turned out that function was completely window dressing. It was always on at all times. And how did she find out? Because her boss started sexually harassing her and asking her why she was speeding the other day at a certain point, whether she'd gone to her boyfriend's house, what she'd done. Like, there's a whole issue there about, time and distance, but also, so time breaks down, physical location breaks down, especially when we don't go even physically into the office, right? So the idea that you would surveil a worker in his or her bedroom at his or her house under those kinds of conditions, there's a level of a breakdown of boundaries there. And finally, last set of boundaries that are really broken down along those same lines is, what is the identity of a worker as a worker? Like, what do you need to know? Do you really need to put a Fitbit on all your workers so that you can find out what their heart rate is, that they went for a jog one morning, that they had sex over the weekend, that, with the temperature tracking, you can figure out women's fertility cycles? Do you really need to know that? Is that really relevant to their work that you're asking them to do? So there's breakdown in all these things. And then what are you doing with that data? It's not protected under HIPAA, under, healthcare privacy standards, because you've quote unquote given it to your employer voluntarily. How voluntary is that? We got to talk about that, because some of these systems, you're asked to do that for the employee health plan. You have to wear a Fitbit. You have to, do a certain number of steps, whatever it is, and that bleeds into all kinds of things where the manager is in the worker's life in ways that don't seem to relate directly to the idea of what you're asking them to do as a worker. So that's got a creepy element to it too. I want to get back to the issue of managers being uncomfortable with this, though. I mean, a lot of managers sometimes just have an ick factor. They don't want to see into their employees' bedrooms or the workers' bedrooms. They don't want to be doing this. But a lot of it is also, I want to point this out, pressure from regulators. Pressure from competitive sources. So especially if you work in the financial sector, there may be an expectation by the regulator that you have put this kind of tracking software on everyone's phones. And if someone is texting and it turns out that they're insider trading, the immediate assumption of the regulator becomes, why didn't you have control over this? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you know earlier? You have this software available, so why are you not using it? And they're not thinking about the damage, and we can talk about this separately, that all of these, that all these there are these harms under to that surveillance. There are harms to that control, and that's not what, and there are harms to workplace morale, to employee ethical engagement, to all these other factors. We've now found this out with all this research and all these studies, but that's not what the regulators are thinking about. The default is if the company is not exerting control in ways that it could, that its compliance systems are weak, and that is a very dangerous set of defaults because it pushes companies to adopt all this stuff, which is frankly invasive. They don't need it. They don't want it. It poisons their relationships with top employees who tend to leave if they're overly surveilled. All these other things. And there's an ick factor for managers. They don't want to look at it. There's an issue here too. And there's a sabotage issue for workers who, again, why do you need to know my fertility cycle? It's just creepy, right? At some point you say no and you rebel against it. And then there's the competitive pressures that these software systems are often sold with the premise that, you can improve productivity. You can watch keystrokes and how much somebody's spending time on email versus this, versus that, versus the next thing. Well, if that were really true, then give it to the worker, right? The manager doesn't need to see, that all of a sudden you found out that your uncle had cancer that day, and so you weren't email more, grill you on that. Really? It's a breakdown of a level of trust, but I think that really good managers and ethical companies get really tied up in these impossible sets of expectations that are coming at them. And frankly, you have a problem where very ethical managers who say no to a lot of this, sometimes they're replaced. And they're replaced because of there are all these economic and regulatory pressures to engage in this kind of surveillance, and the field moves further and further and further without any kind of check, without the thought about, okay, we can do all this, should we? And who's going to say no? And how are you going to have support to say no? These are collective action problems, and often the only solution to a collective action problem is a collective action, where you say, okay, these are going to be the standards and this is how this works, or should work.
So you've talked about the impact on culture and the impact on human beings of these systems, and you've really described something where the system, the structure of management has a logic that in many senses individual human managers want to resist but don't know how. There's a question in the chat which I think is a logical question for people less just learning about this, but the question is, how is this being addressed? What's the legal fight happening around this? Because and what you're describing is something where the law is in fact accelerating these issues rather than providing any sort of opportunity to resist. So what are the legal issues around this? And then second question, what, if anything, can we do about it? And then I want to leave a little bit of time for the protests and the state surveillance machine as well.
Yes, no, we have a lot to talk about. So I will try to be brief, and if you want me to unpack some of this, I'd be happy to, but so I know we've got to stay on time. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Let's talk about it. So first of all, let's start with the fact that at the federal level, so there's federal regulation, state regulation, local regulation. At the federal level, we have really no good regulation of this at all. So I've done some really interesting research on this. I'm not going to take too long talking about it, but if you go back to that Civil War history, so this got me thinking, and this is actually what material I work on. This got me thinking, what happened to autonomy? We fought the Civil War in part over the idea that we didn't want these kinds of shadows or badges and incidents of slavery in the workplace. If you think about the 13th Amendment ended slavery. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment and the framers of the 13th Amendment were very explicit that they were abolishing slavery and they were abolishing the shadows of slavery going forward. That they didn't want any part of slavery going forward. Now that you found the historical ties explicitly between the management techniques now being used in the workplace and the management techniques in their origins in slavery under 13th Amendment jurisprudence, this should be an actionable issue, right? That there's that explicit tie. Much more to unpack there later. But and I do want to be very careful. When you go into this territory, I want to be very, very careful. I am not equating the harms from limitless worker surveillance directly with the far greater and far more insidious and horrible harms from slavery and the entire impact on enslaved people. I'm not doing that. What I am saying is that there are these historical echoes and that there's a harm here. And we can get into this because this is part of your discussion about what's happening with the riots in response to George Floyd and how there still are racial echoes to this surveillance and to this feeling of invasion and feeling out of control. So what I was but you asked me about the legal history, so I'll just quickly go back to that and trace that. So we had the 13th Amendment, which was specifically about workplace conditions and the shadows of slavery, the badges and incidents of slavery in workplace conditions. There is a right to be left alone that evolves in the codification after the Civil War. It becomes, and the right to be left alone was a right of what we might think of as personhood. The invasion of the body, the invasion, your interactions with people. It was a very broad, I think the word is autonomy, protection of autonomy. We don't use the word autonomy in the law, but it's something that's used in philosophy, psychology, political science, economics, every other discipline. So part of what got me searching on this is where the heck is autonomy in the law, right? We saw a first split with Warren and Brandeis. Brandeis and Warren did an article in the 1890s where Brandeis, and this will now seem very quaint, but it tells you how far this issue has gone. Brandeis was really upset that the portraits that were painted of his daughter's wedding were publicly published. And he thought, and he was railing against the yellow journalism of the day, and he thought that this right to be left alone included a right against the invasion of privacy. And so it was specifically his mind, yellow journalism. And he roots it also in trespass, in property violations. Well, think about those two issues. If you're talking, if a sort of bigger issue of right to be left alone, which includes autonomy, gets narrowed into just two things, which becomes speech and basically property trespass, in the workplace, you're going to lose on speech because commercial speech is less and less regulated. In fact, our Supreme Court has gone has gone to the extremes to supposedly protect speech, but when it's talking in the employment context, you have very little right to speech. And the right to speech, to freedom of speech, is a right against the government. It's not a right against a private employer. So you're going to lose on speech, essentially. And when you think about the right to privacy as being based in property rights and or trespass, when you're a worker and you're going to the company's property, who has the right of trespass? The company, not you, right? So you're going to lose that all the time. And that's a whole series of Fourth Amendment cases that we've also found that, workers have no rights. And then there are some state level issues where we have protections of privacy, but a lot of times those are based on shock the conscience tests. So if something is so shocking, well, something's only shocking the first time you see it. And then afterwards, we're numb. So if you look at the cases that were shocking in the 1970s, they look quaint. They look as quaint as Brandeis, being upset about the portraits from his daughter's wedding being published, right? And if you look at, and so that's disappeared over time, there are no boundaries there. And the courts have given tremendous deference to business necessity. Well, you can always come up with a business necessity why you need to surveil someone, right? I needed to watch them in the bathroom because I was worried about them doing drugs. Okay, well, there are so many other ways that you could do that other than watch them in the bathroom, right? Like, and they're on your property. So if you think about it in a property right sense, it's your property. So the workers are just never going to win the arguments on those bases. So the question becomes, what happened to that larger right to be left alone, which would carry with your person, right? And so very quickly, because this is a longer discussion, what we saw happen in the 1970s was there was an explicit split, and this is still fascinating because I think that there was a racial tone to this. This was about the same time as domestic workers and agricultural workers, and think about the two, the ethnic group that largely was the agricultural workforce and the domestic workforce in the U.S. South, were exempted from unemployment insurance, and we're exempted from all these things. So there are these carve-outs that look neutral but have a racial undertone to them. Eventually, that was changed in employment compensation, but unemployment claims. But it was about the same time. What happens in the law is that there's a split between privacy and autonomy. And watch this set of definitions. Privacy becomes what you get in the workplace. Autonomy is defined as everything outside the workplace. Well, think about that. That's completely backwards. Privacy, your private life, is not in the workplace. Privacy should be at home, right? And if you're going to have a waivable right to privacy, it should be a waivable right to privacy that you have in a commercial sense, maybe on a one-off transaction. There are all these issues of coercion when you're thinking about privacy being waivable that appear in the workplace that with your, mortgage and your, job and everything else on the line, you don't have the same kind of negotiation that you would in buying a car or something else. This is a repeat interaction with an employer who has tremendous power over you, right? So that's completely backwards. Autonomy, we know from the 13th Amendment, was specifically supposed to be a concern in the workplace. So to define, by definition, autonomy as the thing that you have outside the workplace is to defeat the whole purpose. So I'm arguing we go back to the right to be left alone. I'm arguing we go back to a more expansive definition of autonomy. Right now we have essentially, and there's been great work on this. I go back to the article on limitless worker surveillance. Is literally an article that was published, it was 2017, California Law Review, that nicely describes how there is nothing left of the boundaries effectively to worker surveillance, and that we really need to think about this differently. But what I'm going to argue is it's not privacy law. Privacy is waivable. It should be under autonomy. It should be under the right to autonomy that was really what the 13th Amendment was really our concerns that were fundamental. That is highly controversial. I'm writing all that out. I'm giving the background. A lot of this is the research that I've been doing into the history of that right to be left alone and what happened to it just after the Civil War and these various pressure points going along. But if you're asking about what should be done, I think that I'm gonna give you a very radical solution, which is go back to where the law was and that we fought for, and that were the goals of the thing that we won in the Civil War was supposed to be the protection of autonomy in the workplace. And we need to think about that. We need to think about the protection of autonomy in the workplace and the regulation of autonomy in the workplace so that it doesn't have these coercive qualities. And it certainly has some limits and boundaries now. And those limits and boundaries take into account the harms that such limitless worker surveillance can really have on people in those situations who don't have power to negotiate and really don't give meaningful consent.
So Josephine, we've got 6 minutes left. There's so many good questions in the chat, and then I have more as well. So let's just, there's a good question, and I'll share the questions afterwards with you on email, just in case you have a chance to address the ones we didn't get to. But someone asking about, and I think this is like the prototypical manager, the limits in the workplace of what's appropriate versus what's feasible. Is there any way to think about that pending a change in the law, which is dependent on regulatory dynamics? And then can you talk about what us as citizens could do and maybe tie that to what's going on in terms of protests in the US at the moment? Understanding those are two big questions and there's only 5 minutes left.
Yes, those are massive questions. Okay, I'll just take the first one and hopefully we have time for the second one, because there's a lot of advice I wanted to pass on to people about protecting their own identities from surveillance during the protests and other ways that they can continue to speak up. I would like to get to that, but let me answer your first question first. And I do have some principles and ideas about things that managers should think about in the workplace. And again, I think I want to point out that there are a lot of ethical managers that are caught in this dilemma. I mean, we know already that that less than a third of CEOs who admit that they collect extensive data on their workforces personally feel that their companies are using the data appropriately. And that was pre-COVID-19. That was 2019 statistics. So those were data privacy terms. Those are ancient now, right? So we know there's a lot of discomfort with the collection of all this data, people analytics, whatever you want to call it. It's a lot of, and then running it through artificial intelligence to look for these patterns and maybe finding whistleblowers and rooting them out. And it's just a lot of use of this. Discriminatory impacts of algorithmic hiring. There's been a lot of conversation of just how this stuff is used, how long it's being held, is it being resold, what's happening to it. You can learn a tremendous amount about a person from this. And then even when businesses know that a worker consent and just disclosing even that they're surveilling, they don't even have to sometimes describe what the surveillance is, right? Even disclosing that they're surveilling provides protection, liability protection for the manager. 56% of business leaders admit that they don't actually disclose or ask workers for their consent. So knowing that it's that easy, I think that what that tells you is that there's a lot of sort of guilty conscience here, that there's uncomfortableness with the way that surveillance has evolved and what's happening. And I think that there's a lot of ground for having these conversations. The questions I would really urge managers to ask themselves and companies to ask themselves, who's impacted by the surveillance? So this is an inquiry into how extensive the surveillance is and who experiences it. So for example, why do businesses need to install GPS monitoring on their workforces if only a few of them ever leave the workplace for business hours during the business day? Like for business purposes during the business day. Like, why do you need that? Like, think about who's impacted. It's overly broad. The degree of impact. So the analysis of the type of what the impact of that surveillance would have on the psyche of workers. So is it surveillance that workers can legitimately and meaningfully turn off when they are no longer quote unquote on stage? There needs to be, so one of the things that Shoshana Zuboff wrote about in her Surveillance Capitalism, but she pulled it from psychology that's psychological work that's much older, is the need for people to be backstage. You can't always be on stage. There needs to be a backstage, a place to be able to recoup, to be yourself, to be not monitored. And then, think about, do you really, do you need to know women's fertility cycles? Do you need to know that, that so-and-so had sex the other night? Like, think about that. When that gets out, how does that feel for workers? And then I guess kind of along these lines, how is the monitoring experienced? So certain types of monitoring are particularly oppressive, invasive, demoralizing, microchipping employees, which is now happening. It's not something that's easily removed. Does it have to be that way? Do workers have to be strapped into exoskeletons that transport them from place to place? Do they have to wear a wristband that guides them with haptic feedback, that's the vibration feedback, to the exact location where the bin is? I mean, if you made someone a human robot, something to think about. And how does that feel? Are the data needed? So think about whether there's a lot of additional collection of things that get swept up in the collection of data. So for example, if you establish a specific need for GPS monitoring during certain times, do you need to have your workforce wear fitness trackers that also collect health information such as heartbeat, steps, walks, sleep patterns, temperature? Like, do you really need all that? Yes, it's cheap. It might be in a Fitbit, but maybe you could use a version that's less expensive and really have it turn on and turn off. And then finally, thinking about whether the efforts are counterproductive in the long run. I think these are questions, and this is sort of flipping the lens, especially the conversation we had about regulators earlier, but also about company culture. Is the effort counterproductive in the long run? And you're thinking about the impact of that surveillance in the workplace. Is it changing the workplace culture so that you're destroying worker morale and ethical engagement? Whole other discussion about ethical engagement, but there's a lot of data to suggest that by over-surveilling workers, you actually create more of the problems that you're trying to avoid. That creates resentment, sabotaging of the workplace, employee ethical disengagement because they feel like they are not trusted and not worthy, and that the job is not really theirs, so they don't feel like they're empowered, and you don't get the most creative work out of people. It changes the whole tone of that relationship, and so this is also a call for business people, regulators, others to think about the corrosive effects of all of that surveillance, especially when it's limitless worker surveillance and it's a culture of fear and you're imposing this on people. Is that the cultural and society that we want to live with? Is that the kind of workplace that you want to create? Is that how you want to run your company and keep your best people? Because you're not going to keep your best people. Your best people are going to leave, and there's enormous evidence to show that.
Josephine, we're over time. And I know some people had to drop, and I'm gathering the questions to follow up with you, but I've got to ask you about what's going on in the US. I've got to ask you about what people listening to this that want to take part in these protests might be able to do to protect themselves. And then for everybody I didn't get to your question, we'll try to follow up. I think we've made the case for why you need to pay attention to the work of J.S. Nelson during this conversation. But final thoughts on what we can do as citizens about this.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So I will try to wrap up as quickly as I can, and we can go back to these things because there's far more. Let's think about, so there's the issue of racial inequality that underlies a lot of this. It's definitely part of the surveillance in the workplace experience. If you are, we know that, for example, it's such a privilege, as we talked about already, to be able to work from home. That's only a majority of the top quartile can even do that. And so when you are a frontline essential employee, your experience of this is so much more immediate, so much more visceral, so much more threatening too. And we saw, for example, we mentioned the hospitals clamping down on speech and firing people. We saw that at Amazon. We've seen that at a lot of businesses. The New York Times has been really good about covering some of this. It has been the lockdowns and the employer reactions to COVID-19 have also sometimes had a very explicitly anti-union, anti-labor tone. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Now, in terms of so there's definitely an issue of who the workers are, who this terrible pandemic and the changes in our economy fall on disproportionately, and it tends to be African Americans, tends to be Latinos, tends to be minorities, tends to be these other groups. And in addition to that, we want to talk about something else, which is this issue of feeling out of control. This is part of the harm to autonomy, and it's been very interesting. We just mentioned this before we went on the air, but there's been a lot of talk now about the experience, and I relate this with a tremendous amount of respect, and I'm relating the work of others here, but I think that they're making important ties. That the experience of living while Black in the U.S. is often an experience of feeling out of control. You go for a run, you get shot. You go into a store, you get choked to death by the police. You go into a mall, somebody calls a security guard on you when you're just walking by a store. You go into Central Park to watch birds. There's a woman who doesn't have her dog on a leash. You ask her nicely to put her dog on the leash, which is completely within your legal rights to do so, and you get arrested. Right? So this idea of being out of control, feeling as though these, just the sheer experience of breathing brings on repercussions that are so crazy and life-threatening. That is part of, the need to, I think, to feel like you're resisting authority, and especially as the reaction of authority is to become more and more aggressive, and our president is out there saying, I have police dogs. Wow, does that sound like the 1960s in Bull Connor down in Alabama, like in Mississippi and these other places. Like it's just, there's a racial tone to a lot of this. This exertion of control, this feeling as though the state has you at every point and it's not fair and it's not triggered by that the justice is unfair, fundamentally unfair, that the criminal justice system is unfair, that your interactions with police are unfair, that your interactions with the rest of society are unfair, that somebody's going to call the police on you for all these things. That is part of the set of wounds here. And I think, I'm not saying that is this, let me be careful here. I'm not equating the Black Lives Matter movement and the description of police brutality with limitless worker surveillance. What I am saying is there's an element of feeling like who's got control of you, that harm is, that there's a quantifiable harm to this. So for example, we know that feeling out of control of your work schedule can have the same impact on your mortality rates as secondhand smoke. Like there is a harm, there is a physical harm to you from all this control from outside, aside from being killed by police officers, literally shot at, choked to death, all these other things. And so I think that what you're seeing is an explosion of this. And if you see worker sabotage in the factories and you see worker sabotage in other contexts, then you definitely see that same, obviously different quality, different magnitude, elements of feeling violated, of rage in a population, and feeling like we just burn the whole damn thing down. I do see where that is coming from. And there's a lot of surveillance technology which is being used by the police state to impose this. So let's talk just super briefly about some of those, because I think everybody gets wrapped up in that. If you go out on these protests, make sure you're wearing a mask that covers the majority of your face because of the facial recognition software that's being used. We actually have more closed circuit security cameras per capita in the United States than in China. So you can expect that you're on camera. You can expect that that information is being relayed to police departments that are running it through search engines to find out who people are, and find groups of people, find out who you're associated and watching with, who's next to you, who's around you, who are you talking to. Definitely, the mask is really important, as much of your face as you can, I guess. Definitely, if you can get your eye area somehow, that would be great too, because a lot of the facial recognition software works up here. Then cell phones. Don't carry your smartphone because it's linked to your identity. That we know that U.S. police have set up fake beacons where they'll pull cell phone calls to get the identity of people who are passing and get the identity of people in crowds. So this is really good advice from Wired magazine, actually, that you could get a phone that's a dumb phone and don't put your own information in it if you need to talk to people, or you could put it in a bag that doesn't have radio signals coming in and out of it, so it doesn't do the Wi-Fi connections to beacons. If you absolutely have to have your phone, to keep it off. By the way, once you have surveillance software on your phone, it's, just having your phone off won't do it. People can turn on your microphone remotely and your camera remotely. So the only way to really deal with that is to take your battery out. And you'll notice that most cell phones now, you can't take the battery out. So just don't bring your cell phone if you possibly can. Don't wear clothing with identifiable logos. If you have tattoos, cover them up. You can expect that there are surveillance cameras and the police are watching these crowds, that they're trying to figure out who people are. And if you want to be able to protest in such a way that you are not identified and you're worried about your, the invasion of your personal rights and this coming to find you at work or some other way, make sure that you are not showing up on these identification systems. So I think those are the basics. We can talk about more later, but those would be some tips for people.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry we have to close. We could do with it another hour. For everybody on the line that didn't get to ask their question, I will follow up with Josephine and hopefully she will be able to answer some of those on email if she has a chance. I think this is one of the most important impacts of this pandemic, and even though awareness is growing about this situation, it is relatively low compared to a lot of other human rights crises. So thank you for bringing all this to our attention, Josephine. For anyone interested, J.S. Nelson is a prolific author. Her work is incredibly worth reading, and we will follow up and hopefully see you next week. But thank you so much for joining us today. Amazing. I just wish we had longer. Thank you.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for talking about some of these issues.
Hi, it's Christian Hunt here. I'm the host of the Human Risk podcast, and I'm here to introduce a brand new series called Breaking the Fever. As we all adjust to the coronavirus and the implications for all of us, personally and professionally, this series will help inform and guide your thinking about what is happening and what happens next. Breaking the Fever is a weekly webinar, but we wanted to ensure it reached the widest possible audience, so this podcast will contain the audio recording for each session. In this introductory episode, I'm joined by the curators of Breaking the Fever, Alison Taylor and Jerome Tager, who are here to introduce it. So Alison and Jerome, why don't we kick off by you both introducing yourselves and then we can talk about what this series is all about. Alison, why don't you start?
Sure. So my name is Alison Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Ethical Systems, which is a research collaboration based at NYU Stern School of Business, focusing on building more ethical and effective organizational cultures. I'm also a senior advisor at BSR and an adjunct professor at NYU Stern as well.
Fantastic. And Jerome?
Hi, I'm Jerome Tager. I'm the CEO of an organization called Preventable Surprises. It's an independent think tank that focuses on systemic risks in the financial system, otherwise known as environmental, social, and governance risks. It's a space I've been working in for the past 15 or 20 years. I lose track of time, at the intersection of business, society, capital markets, and the United Nations.
Great. And so look, what is the idea behind Breaking the Fever?
When the coronavirus hit and the economy started tanking, I looked around me and saw that a lot of people in my professional universe and around my friends had a lot of questions and a lot of anxiety and concerns and wondered what's going to happen to us, how do we take care of this, and how do we get back on track or out of this gigantic hole that we're digging. And I sensed a strong appetite for community. So I did what everyone does in those situations, which is I screamed and called for help and found Alison.
So Jerome and I got talking and we figured that we knew really complementary networks of people. I know a lot of people from sustainable business, from risk, from geopolitics, from ethics and compliance. Jerome has a fantastic network in the ESG investment community and also responsible business community. And we thought it would be fun to get this group of people together and think in a truly cross-disciplinary way about how we might use this crisis to shape a better long-term future for society and for humanity. We have a particular lens on the social and economic consequences of the virus, but we're really interested in bringing together different perspectives from different worlds and seeing if we can enhance creativity and bring divergent ideas together. And
so the podcast is going to be a recording of a live webinar. What sort of things can people expect? What sort of guests have you got, Jerome?
We're really bringing a diverse cast of interesting people. Our first speaker will be Michelle Walker, who wrote a famous book called The Gray Rhino about big, highly probable risks that we do our best to ignore, for example. We'll get people from the investment world, from geopolitics. We're going to have people looking at biodiversity and a number of the angles and the issues that are really capturing the challenges that stem from the virus and from the crisis and that caused it, and really try to have this multidisciplinary learning approach. And I think that's a really important point for me coming into these conversations. It's that it's an opportunity to challenge my own ideas. We know that no single group can solve this magnitude of issues on their own. And that's exchange and cross-pollination of ideas is critical in understanding how different actors in the private sector, in business, in finance, in government, and elsewhere look at these issues and address them and what they think is important and what they prioritize and their strategies and so on. So I'm coming at this to figure out where I need to persist and where I need to abandon my beliefs and take on new ideas.
Fantastic. And look, we're recording this introduction, starting the podcast after we've had a few sessions. So, Alison, what sort of things have you been discovering in the first few sessions that you think are worth sharing at this point to kind of incentivize people to listen to the rest of the series?
I think the importance of thinking systemically is really clear. I mean, there is so much news to absorb. You can easily wake up every morning and spend hours and hours reading about the latest progress of the virus, what's going on in different countries, the latest medical news and that kind of thing. So I think what has been really helpful is to step back and look at the long term. It's really interesting to think about what was already going on in society that the pandemic might accelerate. And it's also really interesting to get some of the smartest minds out there to bring their ideas about what might come up that's completely new or that might completely change. We're not trying to predict the future, but we're trying to think about the trends and forces that are intersecting so that we can get together and intervene and try and shape the future, or at least shape the debate. We're really keen that this is a conversation. We're really not into having lectures. So the other thing I think that's been really fantastic is the amazing questions and participation from the audience. We're lucky to have this really informed audience that brings so much to the debate. And as this goes on and on, we want to have deeper and deeper and more fluid conversations.
Great. I think that serves as the best possible introduction to this series. So if you like the sound of that, you can find this podcast on all of the major platforms. Do subscribe there. And if you like the show, please leave a positive rating as it helps other people to find it. If you're interested in participating in the Breaking the Fever group, you'll find that on LinkedIn. Details of that and other relevant links are in the show notes. So look, all that remains for me to do now is to say thank you so much to both of you for putting this series on. It's fabulous stuff, and I know that lots of listeners are going to get pleasure from the podcast as much as we do from the actual webinars. And thank you also for coming on to help introduce this brand new podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you.